Before President Trump threatened military action against Nigeria, the US already had about 10,000 military people stationed across Africa. For a long time, the US have had military operations happening in Africa, some covertly, some overtly. I'll explain what all of this mean in this video and how it relates to President Trump's threat against Nigeria. My name is Tony. I'm a Ghanaian writer who lives in the US. On this channel, I talk about geopolitics from the perspective of an African. And to get into this, let me lay the table and then bring you the meal. On November 4th, today, the family of Dick Cheney, former Vice President of the US, announced that he passed away. And I have been seeing media reports about his legacy and all that. Majority of the media reports on his legacy have been focused on his work in the Middle East, his work in the US, and so on and so forth. One big piece that is missing is Dick Cheney's work in Africa. And I believe that that is the most important ingredient in the legacy of Dick Cheney. And this video will explain to you what I mean by that. So 9 days after President Bush was inaugurated as president in 2001, he set up a task force headed by Vice President Dick Cheney. The task force has come to be known as the Cheney Energy Task Force. Their job was to draw US energy policy for the Bush administration. And Dick Cheney they started their work in January 29th, and the report came out in the middle of May 2001. And in the report, Dick Cheney said two things that caught the attention of the media, but they focused on just one. The two things was the Persian region, Iraq, Iran, and countries in the Middle East were becoming too volatile for the US to trust its energy future into the hands of the Persian region. The US need to do something about that. That was in the report. And two, he also said that the US needs more oil for its national security because the US energy demands were about to go up by 30% within the last decade. So the US need to find ways to get more oil. Those are the two things usually people focus on. But there was a third and important part in the report. And that was the fact that he added that sub-Saharan Africa produced about 11% of the world's oil at the time. So if the US needed to safeguard its energy future, it needed to pivot to Africa for its oil needs. And it needed to use any means possible to cozy up to Africa. Now I'm using my own words. And this is very important because this was in May 2001 before 9/11. So usually people who believe that 9/11 was an inside job orchestrated by the Bush administration usually cite this report as the reason why they believe that 9/11 is an inside job. But here's the thing. There is a quote by Rahm Emanuel, the chief of staff under President Obama. And that quote is, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." What that means is you don't manufacture the crisis. But if a crisis happens, you take advantage of it. So leaders all over the world do that all the time. So maybe, let me give you a perfect example. Trump and the tariff. The guy who is in charge of the tariff initiative and policies under President Trump had believed in tariff his entire life. He's written books about tariffs, but he's a university professor nobody really took serious. In the 90s, he wrote books about the tariff, 2000s, everything. And a friend of his, President Trump, became president. So he got a chance to implement his tariff policies. The tariff policies were things he had. His friend just happened to become president, and then he took advantage of his friend's presidency to get his policy ideas out. That happens in governance all the time. So I believe what happened in 9/11 was when 9/11 happened, Dick Cheney saw the opportunity to use the war on terror as one of the vehicles for his energy initiative. The war on tariff has some good things, like TSA, even though we all hate TSA. But yeah, you see how all these are connected. So after the 9/11 thing happened, one of the first things the Bush administration did was set up what they call the Pan-Sahel Initiative. So Sahel region is under the sub-Saharan Africa, right? Countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, and Mauritania are part of the Sahel region. And the US started focusing military energy in the Sahel region in the wake of 9/11. The Sahel region at this point did not have any terrorist activities. Nobody involved in the planning and execution of the attacks on the US on 9/11 is from these regions. Yet, the US had a whole initiative for the Sahel region. Of course, there are some historical reasons why we won't get into all of this. But it created an opportunity for the US to start having military presence in Africa. That was one of the, in future we'll talk about that once, but this was one of the first use of military by the US in the wake of 9/11. This was before the Iraq War. It's important to point that out. So the US started military operations in Africa before the Iraq War, but nobody cares about Africa, so everybody's always talking about the Iraq War. And then he set out the 100, the US government set up the $100 million Eastern Africa Counterterrorism Initiative. That came after the Sahel initiative. So this one was an initiative focused on East Africa. So the Sahel thing is in West and Central Africa. And this one is in East Africa. So the US started having military presence in East and West and Central Africa from that point on. But why is this important to our conversation? When the US started having military presence in Africa, they wanted their military operations in Africa to go through two countries, Nigeria and Angola. Here is why. Nigeria and Angola were in Dick Cheney's report about the oil thing. So while they may be trying to fish out terrorists, we're also using this war on terrorists to find oil, like we all know that, right? So Nigeria collaborated with the US a little bit, and then the US started asking for more and more and more and more, and Nigeria at some point have to be like, chill, we need some boundaries. And then 2005, the US set up what they call the Trans-Sahara Counter-Terrorism Partnership. Now, they started partnering with countries in sub-Saharan Africa for military operations. And again, Nigeria and Angola was big in their focus. Ghana was sort of important to the US at this point as well for different reasons, because Ghana will find oil in 2007, but the US companies that was working with the Ghanaian government at a point probably had hinted the US government that Ghana will find oil soon. So Ghana, I think George Bush was in Ghana twice, also became important to the US around this time. And 2007 came, and that is the most important part here. The US started what they call the US AFRICOM, US Africa Command. So now they made it a point to set up their military base in Africa dedicated to military operations in Africa. They approached Nigeria to headquarters, the Africa Command. Nigeria said no. They approached Angola. Angola said no. They approached Ghana. Ghana said no. Ghana said no because, recently President Trump had some beef with Iran. He attacked Iran and Iran attacked Qatar. That is because the U.S. Military base is in Qatar. So Ghana, Nigeria, and Angola feared that if they house the U.S. military base, it will make them target of the enemies of the U.S. You understand? But one of the first operations the U.S. AFRICOM did was a proxy war in Somalia. The U.S. sponsored and supported Ethiopia to attack Somalia in 2007, before the Africa Command was officially inaugurated in 2007, right? But after the Africa Command was inaugurated, the US now started having operations in Somalia. And that led to radicalization of people in Somalia. There's this philosophical thing I always wonder about. You can tell me what you think in the comments. Do you think that 9/11 and the fact that 9/11 happened was the reason that led to the increase of extremism in the world, or the US war on terrorism led to extremism in the world? Because there's evidence that there was a rise in terrorism and extremism in the world after 9/11. Some say it's because terrorists were burdened by 9/11. Some say that the war on terror angered a lot of people into extremism. I'm not convinced on any of them. So I need someone to convince me on it. But yeah, Somalia is going to be the focus on my next video. So I'm having this series I'm calling Trump in Africa, where I'm going to focus on Trump's foreign policy in Africa. This is video 1 or 2, depending on how you look at it, of that conversation. I'm laying the foundation for how Africa came to be part of the US military conversation, right? In the next video, we will talk about Trump's airstrikes in Somalia. Because from 2007, AFRICOM had presence in Somalia. They also had presence in Djibouti. In Djibouti, the CIA had a secret jail where they were snatching people up, accusing them of being terrorists and holding them illegally. So again, whenever people talk about the excesses of the war on terrorism, everybody talk about Guantanamo Bay. Nobody talks about how the US misused its powers in Africa, in Djibouti. Because again, nobody cares about Africa. That is why I have this channel. I really, it is my life goal to shine the light on the role of Africa in geopolitics. So subscribe to this channel and we'll talk about the rest of this tomorrow.